Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to give it just a few minutes for people to file in from the Zoom link, and then I'll introduce us and get started. All right, it looks like we've got quite a few people filing in. So I just want to say hello and welcome to the last day of the 2022 Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to our panel on environmental justice and the historic exclusion of BIPOC people in environmentalism. My name is Lisa Milstein, and I am a conference co-director of POC this year, and I'm going to be moderating this panel for us. I just have a couple of announcements before we get started. So first of all, this is a Zoom webinar. So if you cannot see yourself as an attendee or see any mute buttons or anything, don't worry about that. Everything should be completely, there's no option for you to be seen or heard, so don't worry. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience looking to earn CLE credit, there's going to be a link to register for that on the JOT form, which we will drop in the Q&A section. Within that JOT form, we will have a link to donate to Friends of Land, Air, Water, which is our alumni board, which helps to provide stipends to students who are doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you're interested in making a donation to help provide those stipends, the information to do so will be on that link that's going to be dropped in the chat. Now, lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Elehe traditional indigenous homelands of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continued to make important contributions to their communities. At the University of Oregon and across the land we now refer to as the state of Oregon. PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the traditional tribal nations of Oregon. Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, we will have Dean Jenny Rushlow, as she is the interim graduate school dean at the Vermont Law School. She also serves as the director of the Environmental Law Center and professor of law at the Vermont Law School. Prior to becoming professor, Dean Rushlow practiced law at the nonprofit advocacy organization Conservation Law Foundation and the law firm Anderson and Krieger, both based in Boston. Her practice focused on environmental and land use law, particularly climate change, agriculture, transportation, and environmental justice. Jean Rushlow argued and won a landmark climate law case before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, Kane v. Department of Environmental Protection, and has litigated numerous environmental justice cases. Next, we will have Katie Moreland. Katie was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. She attended Oregon State University and majored in cultural anthropology and minored in Chinese language and culture and earned a food in culture and social justice certificate in these studies. Katie learned about the complexities of global food systems and its many injustices, particularly toward people of color and those living in low-income communities. Katie chose to attend the University of Oregon to pursue a law degree and a master's degree in conflict and dispute resolution. She hopes to use her law and conflict resolution studies to help transform our food system and aid underserved communities in agricultural land acquisition and retention. This summer, she was an honors intern at Vermont Law School's Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at the University of Oregon Law School. She is a Bowerman Fellow in the Food Resiliency Project. And then last but certainly not least, we'll have Victoria Whelan. She was born and raised in Georgia with family ties in upstate New York. She attended Marymount Manhattan College in New York City, where she received a double bachelor's of arts and biology, and urban environmental sustainability with a minor in law and ethics. At University of Oregon, she is one of the Dean's Distinguished Environmental Law Fellows and is currently working with the Sustainable Land Use Project. Victoria is also the social media intern with Action for Climate Emergency, where she creates blog posts, graphics, and micro videos to educate, encourage, and uplift the younger generation as they continue the fight against climate change. Without further ado, I will let our esteemed panelists get started.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lisa. I have a slideshow, so I'm hoping that I can share my screen without an enormous amount of difficulty. And if so, Lisa, I will email the slides to you and ask you to put them up.
Do you see the share slide button in the center of the screen?
I do, yes. It's asking, I don't know that I have sharing capabilities.
Oh, one moment, we will fix that.
Okay. So while we're getting started, I'll just say I'm really honored to have been invited to be part of this conversation. Environmental justice is something that I've cared deeply about for a long time. It's what drove me to go to law school. But I also want to acknowledge that I am not from an environmental justice community, and this is not my personal experience. And I think that's important to say. And as much as possible in talking about the kind of historical perspective of environmental justice and the law, I'm going to reference texts and draw from discussions and resources from communities of color, from BIPOC communities, and let those communities speak for themselves. And I'm an observer and a student of the topic. So what did we learn, Lisa?
It should be available for you to share screen. Just click the green button in the center.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, I'm having trouble with that. Lisa, is it okay if I just email you the slides and you can, okay.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Real quick, I'm just going to do that. And sorry, if I talk into it at the same time, then it'll definitely take longer. Okay. All right, coming to you, Lisa. Okay, so when Lisa gets the slide, she's going to pull up, and the first slide will be an image of a case conflict that I'm going to talk about first, which is really one of the first conflicts recognized as environmental justice. And that is in Warren County, where there was the sighting of a PCB landfill and a plan to dump contaminated soil into this community near Afton, North Carolina. And the photo that we'll pull up is a photo of Reverend Ben Chavez and others that protested this landfill. And the reason why I love, first of all, the pictures from the protests for this conflict are incredible. It was so well documented and showed really the really effective use of lots of different stakeholders in stopping or working on stopping this in their community. So before I really dive into it, I want to acknowledge a couple of different authors and resources for those who might be wanting to learn more about the topic of environmental justice, the history of environmental justice, and first and foremost, Robert Bullard, often referred to and I think self-described as the father of environmental justice. is it the grandfather of environmental justice? It's one of those two things. And he's written several important texts on this topic: Confronting Environmental Racism, Voices from the Grassroots, and Dumping in Dixie. So those are two really seminal texts that I'd recommend. And then I'd also recommend From the Ground Up by Luke Cole and Sheila Foster. Luke Cole was a white lawyer who graduated from Harvard Law School at a time when jumping into poverty law was fairly unusual straight out of law school. And with some colleagues, he ended up building an organization called the Center for Race, Poverty, and Environment, which is based in the Bay Area, that has been really transformational in the environmental justice movement. And unfortunately, he passed away much younger than he should have, in a terrible car accident. But he wrote a lot before he passed away, and so he has multiple books, multiple law review articles. And if this is a topic that's interesting to you and you want to learn more, I'd say those two authors are a great place to start. How are we doing with the slides, Lisa?
So I did not receive an email from you with the slides. I've been refreshing, but is that what you just asked?
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to have come through, unfortunately.
Okay.
And did you just you sent it to the same email that you usually use, correct?
It did, yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna keep going. Okay, so
sorry about
talking about what's that?
I said sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the thing that really defined the beginning of the environmental justice movement was the recognition that environmentalism was really a form of civil rights. And this idea really started in the South, with Black communities identifying, as Robert Bullard has said, environmental discrimination as a civil rights issue. And so it was through that coming together of civil rights leaders and many other members of communities to mobilize against industries and against government, to protect their communities from polluting and dangerous facilities. And this was done with all kinds of different tools: direct actions, political pressure, and litigation, and focused really on two issues, if to oversimplify it. But the fact that industries were targeting their neighborhoods for non-residential uses, garbage facilities, hazard waste, polluting facilities that white communities would not allow and their representatives would not allow to be sited in their neighborhoods, and communities that had less political representation were not well positioned to keep them out of their communities. So there's that. And then there's also the inequitable enforcement of environmental standards. So even if technically environmental standards should apply the same to everybody, if EPA or state agencies aren't enforcing them the same way in different areas and different communities, then that has a discriminatory impact. So the issue that I mentioned in Warren County, North Carolina, that was about toxic waste
Benny,
disposal.
I did get the slides.
And the wish to bury 32,000 cubic yards of soil that's highly contaminated with PHBs. Oh, nice. Okay, good. So we are on the slide with the protesters laying down. There you go. Perfect. Here we are. Okay, great. And I'll just ask you to forward the slides when I'm ready. Okay. So these are folks protesting in Warren County. The source of this contaminated soil was from a New York trucking company it was illegally dumping contaminated oil along North Carolina highways. And they did this because the EPA was making the resale of this oil illegal. And since it would be expensive to comply with the law, they drove their oil from New York to North Carolina, found a place to dump it where they thought nobody would notice. Well, something had to be done with that soil, and the governor of North Carolina decided to bury it in Afton, North Carolina, in Warren County, which is an 84% Black community. It was inevitable that this facility would leak and that contamination would leak into drinking water in this community, because the site where this was going to be dumped had a very high water table. It was not a site, geographically, landscape-wise, that was well suited to taking in this contaminated soil and keeping it contained. So that was an inevitability. So local residents organized and were joined by national civil rights leaders, Black elected officials, religious leaders, environmentalists, and labor groups, and worked together to try and stop this facility. Unfortunately, they were not successful in halting the landfill construction, but, and Lisa, if you could forward to the next slide, the fact that this happened and there was such a strong outcry prompted a number of different things. First, the General Accounting Office, federal office, performed a study of the siting of hazardous waste landfills in the South. And that was done right after Warren County. And the results of that study showed that there is a strong association with the siting of landfills and race and socioeconomic status in the surrounding areas of those landfills. This was also followed by the NAACP's first resolution on hazardous waste and the Commission for Racial Justice performing a study of toxic waste and race. And all of these had the same results, that landfill siting was strongly associated with race and with socioeconomic status. And so while it's heartbreaking that this incredibly well-organized community was not able to stop the facility, they did make a difference. And that action is widely viewed as the beginning of the environmental justice movement as we know it. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to talk about some of the foundational principles of environmental justice as framed by members of the movement. Next slide. This is a photograph from the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, which happened in 1991, which was a seminal moment in the creation of this movement. It was a 4-day summit. It was sponsored by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. And there were about 1,000 people that attended from all 50 states, from Puerto Rico, Chile, Mexico, Marshall Islands. And one of the biggest things that was taken away from this summit was a redefining of what we mean with the word environment. And specifically redefining the environment as where people live, work, and play. And that phrase really was born out of this event. And they produced 17 principles of environmental justice. I've listed just a few here that I think are particularly topical, given that we are coming from a law and policy perspective here. That public policy has to be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, free from any form of discrimination or bias. That the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision making, including needs of assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. And I'll let you read the others. But that was really a huge step forward in being able to articulate those principles so clearly and give us a framework for talking about it. Another major event happened in 1996 at a meeting hosted by the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, where this group produced the Jimez principles for democratic organizing. This was a meeting with the intention of establishing a common understanding between the participants, which was 40 people of color and European American representatives that met in Jimez, New Mexico, to develop a common understanding around democratic organizing. And so this also has been very important and transformational in the development of the environmental justice and other organizing movements. A few important dynamics that I want to highlight, next slide, please, and next one. Before we move on to talk in more detail, next slide. First is that race is the single greatest predictor of environmental injustice. Socioeconomic status, income is associated, but race is the greatest predictor. Interestingly, race is difficult for some people to talk about. And so ironically, it's not uncommon, particularly with government, when discussing environmental justice, not to talk about race. President Biden has vowed to address environmental justice, but I assume as a need to try and develop bipartisan support for his efforts, his strategy is identifying areas that need help, but in a colorblind fashion. Race will not be a factor, according to the New York Times. And yet, as Robert Bullard has studied, he's a sociologist, the most powerful predictor of where industrial pollution will be cited is race. And if you're not talking about race, how are you going to fix it? Next slide. Another dynamic that I think is important to talk about is the economic tensions around environmental justice and environmentalism generally. Workers of color are concentrated in low-paying, unskilled, non-unionized jobs and are twice as likely to be at risk of unemployment. And so there's this conundrum of, do you take a job that puts your life at risk as a result of some of the environmental harms that come with working in certain industries, or do you not have a job? As in many environmental justice communities, the only jobs that are available will be the ones that are most likely to harm your health. So these are all quotes from Robert Bullard. Environmental job blackmail is a fact of life. You can get a job, but only if you're willing to do work that will harm you, your families, and your neighbors. And then finally, the last dynamic I want to highlight is mainstream environmental organizations and the role that they play in these issues. So the historic focus of environmental organizations, national organizations, like Sierra Club, for instance, has been on wilderness, on wildlife, sometimes on population control. And historically, the founders and membership of these organizations have been white people, economically advantaged with above average education. And these organizations, as a result of who is a part of them and their definition of the environment, have been ill-equipped to deal with the environmental and other concerns of BIPOC communities. There has been a recent shift in focus as mainstream environmental groups try and reckon with racial injustice and the role that their organizations have played in perpetuating that. There's been an increase in BIPOC leadership in mainstream environmental organizations, and yet at the same time, there's many high-profile examples of white leaders in these organizations who have publicly disappointed on diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of their internal management and otherwise. One way that environmental organizations are trying to do better is when they're selecting issues to pursue. So if they do litigation, when they're trying to choose a case to work on, including environmental justice as one of the issues involved in terms of either whether it's a case that's important to pursue, or perhaps assessing, is this a case or a matter that this community wants us to be a part of, which for many environmental organizations has not been part of the calculation. One of the downsides of these mainstream environmental orgs getting into this type of work as they start to take on environmental justice cases is that they're then competing for foundation funding with smaller environmental justice organizations, which is, with already scarce resources, that is undesirable for sure. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, I want to talk about law and policy solutions, and then I'm going to talk about one case study before we wrap up. Now, talking about law and policy solutions for environmental justice is complicated and unsatisfying, I have to say. Next slide, please. One of the most important principles for lawyers seeking to work on environmental justice is embracing the notion of community lawyering. And this is an image that was put together by Steve Fishbach, who's a lawyer in Rhode Island who's worked on environmental justice, and that's Luke Cole up there in the corner. Luke Cole wrote a lot and was a big proponent of this idea of community lawyering, where you are empowering the community through the strategies that you're helping with the legal strategies, but ultimately you're building community power by being a part of the struggle that you're helping with. And you're leaving the community stronger than you found them by providing assistance. You're not swooping in, serving as an expert, and then taking off without having put the needs and desires of that community first, recognize the skills and talents and expertise of the members of that community that know their needs better than anybody else. And the phrase that Luke has written about is lawyers on tap, not on top. So serving as a resource, but knowing your place in the struggle. Next slide. Litigation is a very frustrating tool to use when it comes to environmental justice. And one of the places that you'd think we would start with trying to challenge environmental justice, which is essentially a civil rights issue, is the Equal Protection Clause from the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. However, this has not proven to be very effective. First of all, it's limited to discrimination by the government. It has to be a government actor that has caused the discrimination, and it requires proof of intent to discriminate. Discriminatory impact isn't sufficient. So you have to find that smoking gun that the government intended to take a certain action in order to discriminate against people, on the basis of race or some other protected class. A big example of this, South Camden citizens versus the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. That was about the siting of a slag grinding blast furnace in a major BIPOC community, and an approval of an air permit for that facility by the state. So the lawsuit was alleging that it was discriminatory to approve this air permit for this facility. But because the court found that that permitting of the facility was not based on racial animus, that the fact that it may have had a discriminatory impact was not sufficient. They were not able to establish an intent to discriminate. So, okay, 14th Amendment doesn't work so well. What about Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? To really boil this down, there's two parts of Title VI that are important to consider here. One, Section 601 forbids discrimination by state programs that are receiving federal money, which is many state agencies, for instance, a state Department of Environmental Protection. under that part of the statute, you may be able to bring private rights of action. However, this has not been very successful and requires proof of intentional discrimination, which is very difficult to prove. Under 602, where there's been a lot more activity, all of the agencies, federal agencies, are required to establish implementing regulations of Title VI, including EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So if you think there's been an abuse of civil rights, you could file a complaint with the EPA's Office of Civil Rights. And if you did so, you'd be complaining about, the example I just gave in South Camden in New Jersey, perhaps saying that the Department of Environmental Protection in New Jersey had violated the civil rights of this community by approving this air permit. So if you filed that complaint with EPA, the EPA regulations would require you to show disparate impact, not disparate intent. Or discriminatory intent. And so that makes this strategy more appealing because you only have to show that disparate impact. However, there's other limitations that make this an unattractive route. The remedy, if you are successful in a complaint like this, is that they defund the state agency that you've complained about most often, which, if you are a proponent of environmental protection, defunding your state environmental agency may not be the way to improve environmental protection in your state. So that's a real difficult challenge. There's a major issue with the EPA Office of Civil Rights not enforcing these cases. That's something that President Biden has sworn to solve, and certainly has hired some really good people at EPA that hopefully will be able to do that. Next slide, please. I'm going to, let's see. I'll just sort of briefly hit these next two slides. One of the biggest ways that people use the law to address environmental justice is through procedural issues, so to speak. So, for example, the National Environmental Protection Act, or Policy Act, NEPA, requires environmental impact review of major federal actions that significantly impact the environment. And I was involved in a NEPA case, in an environmental justice matter in Massachusetts. And the really frustrating thing about it is that the law just exists to require that agencies give a hard look at the impacts, the environmental impacts of their decisions before they finalize their decisions. They don't have to decide any which way based on what evidence comes up in that analysis. The analysis has to include socioeconomic and health impacts and the cumulative effect of multiple polluting facilities, for example, in an area. But in order to consider socioeconomic and health, it has to have a nexus to the project's impact to the natural environment. So there are many limitations to using NEPA, but it's often part of the strategy. And maybe, while you're pointing out these issues, the politics change around the project, the funding gets dropped from the project, and maybe something else happens along the way. Okay, I'm going to skip to the next slide, please, and just briefly talk about policy. So I focused on litigation so far, but really where a lot of the action when it comes to law on environmental justice is in the policy sphere. So there've been a couple important executive orders on environmental justice. The first was President Clinton. And now we have President Biden, who's issued an executive order. And his take on the issue has really focused on integrating climate change and economic revitalization and job creation. In addition to executive orders, which have some limitations in the sense that their legal enforceability is a little shaky. They often, don't survive enforcement into the next administration, have been state policies. So one example of a state policy that's had a really interesting evolution is the climate change law in California, California, AB 32. There was huge blowback to this cap and trade program because while cap and trade allows for the total emissions of greenhouse gases to decrease for a state or a region, it doesn't determine geographically what the distribution of that pollution will be. And if economic factors and racism and all the other socioeconomic factors that play into where different facilities get cited, with that still being our baseline, more of these polluting facilities are still in BIPOC communities, and they pollute more than just greenhouse gas emissions. And so it was not doing anything to help the fact that there were still co-pollutant impacts, so impacts from other air pollutants that weren't being addressed by cap and trade. So that was a major criticism of this big climate change law, and there was subsequent legislation, but subsequent legislation in California to address that. Okay, I'm going to keep going because I know I'm eating up a lot of time here. So next slide, please. I just want to, I want to give one case study of an environmental justice issue that's not always talked about as an environmental justice issue, but really at its heart, that's what it is. And that's the Keystone XL Pipeline. Next slide, please. So this pipeline was intended to be 1,700 miles long. It started with mining on indigenous lands in Canada and went all the way down to Texas to refineries in environmental justice communities. Along the way, it would cross sacred waterways and wetlands, habitat for endangered species, drinking water, aquifers, spills from tar sands, the type of crude oil that would be traveling through these pipelines are extremely dangerous because it's a very thick material, and it sinks in waterways and is very difficult to clean out. It emits higher greenhouse gas emissions than conventional oil, as well as toxics. And the opposition for this project really focused on the environmental consequences. You know, I mentioned the wetlands, the habitat, but something that may be talked about a little less are the environmental justice impacts and what may have been driving certain communities to fight the facility. Next slide. So this is a photograph of Jean Lomcourt in Fort McMurray, Canada. So the first mine, the tar sands mine, opened when she was a young girl, and it was an open pit that was being excavated for tar sands. And she and her family, and I'm getting this from Inside Climate News that reported on this, she and her family would pass the mine in their boat when they traveled up the Athabasca River. And the fumes from the processing plant at this tar sand site would sting their eyes and burn their throats. And their mother would drape wet cloths over the children's faces to try and protect them. And by the time she was in her 30s, oil companies had leased most of the land where her family had gathered berries from the forest and hunted moose. And today, that same land near her indigenous community is surrounded by mines that have excavated an area larger than New York City, stripping away boreal forest, rerouting waterways. They have huge waste ponds that leach heavy metal into the groundwater. And so this is the origin of these fuels that would travel in the Keystone Pipeline. Next slide. Okay, this is a great video, but I am mindful of time, so I'm going to keep going. Basically, this video shows in Port Arthur, Texas. It's like, go back one, please. This was refineries in Port Arthur, Texas were flaring because of a power outage, and the person who took this video just turns the camera around, and there are 9 fires coming out of these smokestacks all at once. And there's so much smoke that it was, I think, 10:30 in the morning, and the air in the sky became dark. Port Arthur, Texas is where the oil would be refined from Keystone XL, and 12% of the population in Texas is African American, but in Port Arthur, Texas, where most of America's oil is refined, people of color make up more than 66% of the residents near these incredibly hazardous sites. Okay, I'm going to wrap up just by this slide here. This last slide, Lisa, gives a little more context on the life of this permitting process, from it being proposed under the Bush administration. Shortly afterward, there being major oil spills in the public sphere, and then this back and forth on the pipeline, including President Obama, who initially was apparently friendly to the project, because the State Department under President Obama released an environmental impact statement saying it was unlikely to alter global greenhouse gas emissions because no single infrastructure project will alter the course of oil development in Alberta. And ultimately, after a 13-year fight, this portion of the pipeline was stopped. But I'll just leave with that phrase from President Obama's EIS, that stopping one project as terrible as this, that goes from indigenous land to Port Arthur, Texas, just stopping one project is not enough to change the course of oil development. That is really a problematic point of view, and a great example of why we end up with this destruction in EJ communities. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I did want to let our other panelists know that fortunately, we do not have a panel following after this one on this line until 3:30. So if you are available and we go over a little bit, that's okay. We don't have to worry about a panel on this line right afterwards, starting with Katie.
Hello, everyone. Is everybody able to hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Rushlow. That was really informative and just a lot of context to what the EJ movement is about and the historical context behind that. I learned a lot. Thank you. So I am a 3L at University of Oregon, getting a master's degree in conflict and dispute resolution and a law degree at the same time. I thought that was a great idea at the beginning of my journey. 4 years out of 5 in, it's been a lot, but I've learned a lot about myself and about the environmental justice and environmentalism as a whole. So following Professor Rushlow's slideshow, I want to talk a little bit more and have some perspective about the lived experience as a Black woman from Oregon, trying to do work specifically in food sovereignty, and kind of give a little bit narrative about kind of my experiences and where I found myself now in law. So I just find narrative to be not only informative, but can give a lot more deeper context to what we know as facts, and give a little bit more energy and spirit to what's been going on the grassroots level. So as Lisa said in that really lovely bio, I am from Oregon, born and raised, and I went to Oregon State University for undergrad. I, after a couple of years doing business finance and not liking accounting classes, I changed my major to cultural anthropology, and I fell in love with food studies. I had a professor, ironically, the first Black professor I've ever had was, I was 21 years old, was a Black woman, and she was teaching the anthropology of food. Changed my life, not only as my interests, but also kind of showing me what a Black woman in academia in the future could do with the field I was in. So it was a pivotal moment of my life. From there, I kind of dedicated, I want to say, the majority of my studies to food. I love food. I think it is not only tasty and delicious, but food and production of foodstuffs and transporting of foodstuffs really shows kind of any ill of humanity can be seen in the food system. to any, and like the beauties of the humanity in the food system. What is the first thing you do when you go to someone's house? They offer you food. When you go to a new country, what is the first thing they do? Try our dish, try our, regional alcohol, try our regional, food stuff. Like folks are proud of their food. And it's not only just for consumption, it's about culture, it's about identity, it's about pride. And when folks get into conflict over food and food production, it's more than just an economic factor of growing and producing. There's pride there, there's identity, there's culture, there's spirituality as well too, a huge one that we don't talk a lot about in the law. So food can show so many things, and the complexity of it, especially now we have a global food system where single regions can feed the world. So I fell in love with it, and I was doing all kinds of things on the local level, going to farmers markets, volunteering from, winter markets and all kinds of things. But it was definitely for Oregon, a stark realization that 75 to 80% of the time, I was the only Black person in that space. I was the only one. And as someone who lived in Oregon her whole life, I'm used to being one of few in spaces because that's just the demographic of our state. For very, racist and white supremacist reasons. We know Oregon had one of the only constitutions to outlaw and ban people of color, specifically Black people from the state. So there's a really racialized history of Black representation in Oregon, and then also in our global food system. So we think about colonization, the world was colonized for land and for natural resources at the expense of genocide of Indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Black peoples in the Americas, and taking advantage of communities all over the world and changing their lives and lifestyles and traditions forever. So in some cases, language is lost, traditions lost. So when you talk about food, you're talking more than just what we have on our plate. There's so much more there. And it really saddened me in my journey that when we would have those conversations, especially with well-intentioned white folk, that they would get uncomfortable. That is the reality of our system. That is the reality of what we do and what we have to deal with. So I just got so fed up being the only person seeming to talk about, like, doesn't this bother you that I'm the only one here? No one else is bothered by this? And sometimes I would get like uncomfortable agreements, be like, oh yeah, you're right. And other times it'd be like, oh, race, bringing race into everything. This is about the environment. This is about access to healthy food, but not realizing that access to healthy food is rooted in white supremacy, rooted in colonialism. It's rooted in violence. So you have to take accountability for that. So ultimately, by the end of my journey in undergrad, I left the environmentalism. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I felt like I was shouting at walls, like shouting in the ether with no one listening to me. And so when I found myself back into law school, again, full circle things, why did I think I wanted to go back into business transactional law, where I started for undergrad? Did tax law during the summer, had a great experience with the organization, but that was not where my heart was at. And I knew that coming in. I just didn't want to be in environmentalism. I just didn't like how it felt like folks were more worried about the trees and the animals and people. They didn't care about the people who were around these things. And I couldn't deal with that. I'm a very people-focused, human-focused, like academic, and that's what I wanted to do, is help people. And it just seemed like some of these folks who, especially the, outdoorsy, I know we've had really cool things recently about reclaiming outdoorsy and reframing that for me, which I love. But growing up, that was not something that we did. Black people didn't do that. Not only just because of just stereotypes, but also environmentalism has to understand that some spaces of the environment have histories and collective memories of violence. Especially, we talk about Black folks in agriculture. We were forcibly removed from our country to the States for perpetual servitude on stolen land from communities that were and, removed and from genocide. Like, that's a heavy piece we have to really acknowledge for communities of color to engage in these conversations in these spaces that, history of environmentalism in this country has been violent. So all that being said, I came back into it because I finally found a professor, and finally was a time that we had folks who were talking about that were encouraging people of color, Black people, to use their own traditional identities and traditional ways of understanding the environment. And that was outdoorsy. That was environmentalism. I don't have to go on a hike to know that I love to go outside and be outdoors. How many times did you sit outside in the patio with your, family and just sit out and, talk and do all the things? That is outdoorsy. You're outside, you're enjoying your space and place where you live. And now that I've been kind of settled into that reframe of what I enjoy about being in the environment, I love a good hike, don't get me wrong, but I also know that there's other ways of engaging with our environment, and that environment not only is out in the wilds, but also in our spaces and places that we live. Yeah, like that quote that Professor Rushlow says, it's, where people live, work, and play. That's the environment. And so now that I do that, I'm really interested in agriculture and food, for BIPOC communities to be able to not only work land, but own it, and own it in ways that work for their identities and people outside of just the property ownership and, parcel of land per family. We have so many different ways of imagining how land can be used and occupied and quote unquote owned. So the more we have more voices, Indigenous, Black, and other people of color voices, to really kind of take our minds and imaginations outside of what we have for community property and what, the public lands could be, what private ownership, how that we can work with that to make more communities accessible to these spaces, and not only for land and food, but also for play. We want to have more folks to feel safe in their spaces, healthy in their spaces. So that's kind of my narrative of why I'm in this place and space, and why EJ is so important. We need more voices to not only with current policy and practices and litigation, but also to reimagine what we can do, what we can use the law for, conflict resolution can be used for. We need more. So I thank you so much for letting me be on this panel, and I'm gonna pass it over to Victoria.
Thank you, Katie. I feel like we're gonna have a very, not similar talk, but just the way it's going to be framed. I guess I will also be giving my narrative and my experiences with environmental racism and environmental justice. But before I begin, I just wanna preface what I'm gonna talk about with climate justice is racial justice. And I really believe that we cannot accomplish any active change in the climate sphere without acknowledging race and race relations and the intersectionalities of people and the climate. And like my bio said, I am a ENR fellow, and I'm actually in the Sustainable Land Use Project. And so my talk is going to be more focused about how environmental justices and injustices form with zoning laws and housing and things like that, because that's another aspect that people really don't think about when they hear environmental justice. Like Professor Rushlow's PowerPoint, people typically hear environmental justice or environmental racism, we automatically do think of the pipelines because they are so heavily prevalent in our news and our society, because we are focused on, climate change and greenhouse gases and things like that. But there's so many other intersections of environmental justice, which I hope is the biggest takeaway that you're getting from this panel today with Katie and I and Professor Rushlow's talks. So for me, I started getting into the movement, like Lisa said, I went to undergrad in New York City, where I was a double science major. And I've always loved the environment. My second major was urban and environmental sustainability. And taking these classes, I learned how science is very black and white and doesn't take into account the people that it's affecting. And when you think science, you just think of graphs and numbers, and that's what these climate activists and climate scientists are putting out. And it's not really that accessible to the everyday layperson. And so one of my classes that I had to take was an environmental justice course, and we read a book called Toxic Communities by Dorketta Taylor, which is another fabulous recommendation that everyone should read if they would want to learn more. And that blew my mind. That kind of set my path to law school. And in that book, it talks about, like, for example, Warren County and just different things, and how housing and land use have to do with race. And what people don't realize is that, you know, these terms like ghettos and things like that, or the slums, you know, they weren't always called that. They were made those terms because of segregation. And we still have terrible zoning laws and policies in the United States currently, and especially in Oregon, which, like Katie mentioned before, was a state to exclude Black people. And one of those ways they did that was through zoning and housing laws, because it's one of the most effective ways to get rid of Black people from communities. And just for example, if you really don't understand like zoning laws like that, examples would be like block busting, where owners or realtors or owners would be informed or encouraged to sell their properties under market value or for cheap because they're being told that Black people or people of color or low income people are moving into the neighborhoods. There's also redlining, which was an illegal practice where you could move into this community, but that grocery store down the street might not take your EBT card, or that doctor's office down the street will say, hey, we're not gonna give you insurance, or your whole house might not have insurance. And so policies like this are just so damaging, and it forces that segregation, and it forces communities of color and low-income people to be forced and trapped in these areas where there are contamination, where there are the landfills, where there's the toxic waste, where there are the pipelines. And people ask, you know, why don't they move? Because they can't, because of the policies we have in place, because of the redlining, because of the block busting, and because these people are deemed with less rights than others. I think it's really important when talking about environmental racism as well, and environmental justices, is to acknowledge that there is the term white saviorism, and just overall with the environmental movement in general, you don't hear about cases, or you don't hear about the troubles until a quote unquote white person comes and brings it up. Like, for example, for the Dakota pipeline, those communities in the indigenous nations there were fighting for decades for their voices to be heard, for the government to shut it down. And yet it took celebrities like Shailene Woodley, Jane Fonda, and all those to come up and say, hey, this is not right. Why weren't you just listening to the people who are fighting for this thing in the first place? It's really an interesting look into how race plays with the environment and where you are located and how you are viewed. And people think that climate change happens to everyone. It's happening to everyone, obviously. It's an international crisis, but yet climate change impacts communities of color worse and first. Point blank, period. That is another great takeaway. These island communities who are now just being shrunk underwater, you know, people on the coast, like in Puerto Rico or in Florida or in Miami, they have these neighborhoods that are basically being flooded because of gentrification, and they don't have anywhere to go. They couldn't escape because they couldn't afford to leave. You know, you can also see this, for the example, with Hurricane Katrina. A large Black community just trapped in just unthinkable conditions because they did not have the funds or the resources to get out. And that in itself is also environmental racism. There's so many intersectionalities that it's actually quite scary when you kind of take a deep dive into it. And that's kind of what pushes me to to this movement. I am currently a 1L, and I joined the movement quite late. It was when I took that environmental justice course, which was my junior year of undergrad, where I was like, I'm going to law school. I don't know how I'm going to get there. Hopefully I can graduate on time with adding this extra minor. And, you know, I feel like people think it's kind of difficult to get into activism and to get into, you know, fighting for a cause, but really you just need, you know, one pure spark of inspiration and just kind of go for it. And when I decided that I wanted to go to law school, I knew that I wanted to be a voice for the people, and I wanted to, you know, help be the microphone for these communities, because they are the voiceless. They are already there and they are already doing the work, but they do not have the resources or the people to help them get to the court cases, you know, get to the public officials, get to the policymakers. And so I wanted to make sure that I have every tool under my belt to make that possible. And to me, that was getting a JD. And during my senior year, I took on 2 fellowships. One was for Our Climate, which is a great youth-based environmental justice movement that is national, that focuses on different states' environmental justice movements. And then I also worked for a coalition called New York Renews, which passed one of the largest environmental justice and climate policy bills in New York State, which was the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And we were in the process of creating and lobbying for the Climate and Community Investment Act, which is a bill that would charge $55 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions from corporate polluters, and that money would go directly back into BIPOC and low-income communities. And that's the key of any policy, I believe, is also, just like Professor Rushlow said about community lawyering, it's that community organization that you need to make something successful, because these communities already have the issues, they already know the troubles are, and you just need to listen to them and stay informed and to help them get out of these situations. And so that bill is currently still being lobbied for. But that money goes directly back into BIPOC communities for, you know, projects at their community centers for small scale and large scale renewable energy resources, like solar panels on the apartment buildings or on the houses or on community centers, or offshore wind if they're near the coast. And also doing that, I got involved with the Shinnecock Nation, who is in the Hamptons, and they are currently facing incredible pushback from the local government to get their land back. And because of climate change and because of the rising waters, they're getting pushed further in, just away from their tribal grounds and their homelands, and the marshes are getting flooded and their food sources are going away. And then, you know, the Hamptons are a very big vacation spot for a bunch of billionaires and the upper class. And so they're buying out places, they're buying out land, they're buying land that was burial grounds for some of these nations and some of these communities, and there's getting no pushback. And it's just really sad to see voices not being listened to because of the color of their skin or because of their culture. And it was a great experience that I had. They had a land back, kind of like a month-long land back sovereignty camp. And I went for a weekend and camped out up in the Hamptons in the middle of the winter. This was around Thanksgiving time. It was so cold. I was in the middle of the woods, but I was like, this is what needs to be done. I need to learn more from this community. I need to see what resources are available, and I need to help in any way I can. And just knowing me, I was a senior in undergrad. I knew that I couldn't really bring much to the table, but I knew that this information would come back to help them in the future, and would come back to help other people who look like them and who look like me, because I'm experiencing those experiences in real life, and I'm seeing what other communities are seeing. Because growing up, I didn't really have any injustices in my particular community. I grew up down south, which that's a different conversation, but environmentally, you know, I felt secure and safe. And to kind of back that up, I have severe asthma, but it had been under control for the longest. And when I first moved for undergrad to New York City, the dorm rooms were in Midtown, and that's a very construction-based, subway-based, traffic-based area. And for the first time in like 10 years, I had a major asthma attack where I had to go to get on the subway because I couldn't afford to take a taxi, to the urgent care, hope that they could see me, hope that they had a nebulizer. And I sat there for like 3 hours just waiting for my breath to come back. And that inspired me for my senior thesis to write a research paper, which was a quantitative assessment of environmental racism in New York City through the lens of air pollution, asthma, and COVID. And that's another thing that people don't think about is we are in the middle of a pandemic as well, and communities of color and low income communities are being hit first and worst by this pandemic because of environmental injustices that have been happening for centuries in their communities. My research paper, it was a great experience to look at the data, and it was also just disheartening because you hear the stats that Black kids and Black people are 5 times more likely to have asthma, Hispanic people are 3 times more likely. And it's because that they are forced to live in these areas that are next to the construction sites, that are in high density traffic areas, who are near the waste treatment facilities. And it's just the stark differences of just location and how your family and your future generations are going to grow up it's really an interesting look into just the lens of racism in general. But I think that's all that I want to say. I would love to leave some time for questions. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to all 3 of our speakers for those talks. That was really informative and passionate, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day to speak to us. Unfortunately, actually, I don't think we're going to have time for questions because we're about 10 minutes over already, and I don't want to keep everyone. But I really appreciate that you all came and listened and talked. That was really, really amazing. Thank you so much. And have a really, really nice rest of your Sunday. Yeah.